Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this panel. We have been checking the right image, and the right image will appear. I am Gloria González Fuster. I'm a research professor at the Free University of Brussels in Brussels. I'm the co-director of the Law, Science, Technology and Society Research Group, and I'm very glad to welcome you all to this panel on automated gender attribution. I will say a few words about the background of this panel, and then I will just let the speakers speak. Why do we have this panel at CPDP? Why are we here? Basically, CPDP has for already 6 years has foreseen a special panel every year on gender-related issues related to privacy, data protection, and gender, because we thought it was important that at least there was one panel every year addressing the many issues that pop up in this area. So we have this panel, and for already 6 years, they are very kindly just entrusted to me the organization of a panel on whatever subject I think it's important in this field of subjects. So I'm grateful to CPDP. Thank you very much. Having said this, it's not always easy to organize a panel, and this year for me was really not easy at all. I thought I had good ideas and I had interesting subjects and interesting speakers, and I contacted people, and everybody was telling me, no, I'm busy, thank you very much, great subject, let's do this next year. And I thought, oof, next year, why can we have an interesting subject that we can discuss next year? And then at some point I really had a big crisis, and I thought, really, why am I even caring for this panel, why am I doing this? And then in this big crisis, in this big moment of darkness, I thought, really, why I'm doing this? I'm doing this because I really think there are some subjects that we have to discuss that people are just not discussing. I really don't understand why. And then I thought, what is really the main subject that we have to discuss now urgently for me? And this is the subject, automated gender recognition, attribution, just machines deciding which is our gender. I thought that is not something that we can just let go. And we have to have this on a panel. So I started contacting speakers for this, and all of them said yes, because I think they're equally as busy as the other speakers for the other subjects, but they all see that we really have to discuss this now. We have to have the discussion. So thank you very much to all of you who are our speakers. I'm very, very happy to have them all here. I will just briefly introduce them and then I will let them talk. The first one in order of appearance is Professor Sonia Katyal of the University of California. She's co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, and she's doing an amazing job in all of my favorite subjects brought together. So human rights, technology, and gender, and all these issues, and the intersection of all these issues. So I'm very honored to have you on board for this panel. Thank you very much for being with us. The second speaker, I really don't know how to introduce the second speaker. It's Oz, and I can just say I'm a great fan of Oz. I think there are more fans here. And when I had this confirmation that Oz was on the panel, just wrote emails to everybody, and they said, I'm a great fan of Oz. And I said, no, I am a great fan of Oz. So this is the kind of discussions that we have. Oz is really a reference for all of this, and even the European Commission knows this, and eventually sometimes puts references to the work of Oz in important documents. The third speaker is Daniel Leufer. Daniel is here in Brussels. This is why we all have we have no hairdressers. You recognize the people in Belgium. And Daniel came to Brussels, and we met briefly Daniel at some point, I think already a year ago. He's a Mozilla fellow at the NGO Access Now. So doing many things, but basically following with some critical thinking all these discourses around AI, and trying to see also I think many possibilities there for activism and just thinking critically from this perspective. So welcome, and it's also a great pleasure to have you here. And last but not least, Karen Melchior. She's a lawyer and a politician. She's a member of the European Parliament, and also working on those subjects that we think are very important. She's with the Renew Europe group and the European Parliament. You're coordinating the Legal Affairs Committee, and you are a member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. So again, really very important intersection of many things that matter to us. So please welcome here, and we will. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Much more, because I think we have the panel is constructed in a way that the audience will realize eventually what this is about. This is about this automated recognition or identification of gender. And for the audience, just know that you have the possibility to ask questions. This did not work for me 2 days ago, but it worked this morning. I tried to ask questions in other panels just for annoying them, and it worked. So please ask questions, and I will see them, and I will read them to the speakers. Well, all this I just finished, and I give the floor to our first speaker, Professor Katyal. You have slides, so they will appear as soon as you start speaking.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be at this conference. I was looking at the program and was just amazed at the range of topics that were being discussed. So we're here today to talk a little bit about the intersection between AI, artificial intelligence, and its impact on gender, the categorization of gender, the construction of gender, and the imposition of gender categories on people. I guess what I want to start with is I'm going to basically give you an overview of a bunch of different kinds of technologies that I think raise concerns about gender in a variety of different ways. And I should say that this comes from a project that I've been doing with Jessica Young, who's one of my students. And this project is a paper that's called the Gender Panopticon, and I'm happy to send it to anyone who just drops me an email. And basically what the paper does is look at a bunch of different kinds of AI-powered technologies and really kind of explores the question of what the impact is of these technologies on the categorization of gender. So let's go to the first slide of the second slide of the presentation. Okay, great. So what the paper basically does is it goes through a bunch of different kinds of technologies and their impact in particular on trans and non-binary populations. And the most apparent way in which AI-powered technologies really fail to take into account the fact that many people identify as something beyond male or female is when trans and non-binary travelers enter into the securitized system within airports. And as soon as they enter into these scanners, the guard is required to basically decide whether or not they're male or female. And it's done based on the way that their gender presentation presents to the officer. The problem with this is that this often means that individuals who are trans and non-binary identified wind up basically alarming the system and requiring a system where they wind up being surveyed and subject to greater security checks than other members of the population. And this is a really good example of how there just are no other possibilities other than identifying as male or female. And it's due to someone's subjective determination of what gender constitutes. Now, for most people who are cisgender identified, that's not a problem. But for many individuals who are trans and non-binary identified, this opens up a possibility of even greater surveillance. It opens up a possibility of harassment if their documents do not match the gender that they present in. And it really creates a system where I think increasingly when we rely on more and more AI-powered systems, we see situations where individuals, there's a tremendous number of trans and non-binary people in the world, particularly in Berkeley where I teach, and these are systems that simply do not include or identify other ways of identifying beyond male and female. And that's just one example in terms of scanners at airports. There are other kinds of issues that come up with facial recognition. So a number of years ago, Uber decided to institute a kind of real-time ID policy where they would ask individuals to take selfies at particular prompts so that those pictures could then match with their official documentation. And the problem, and this was done for security reasons, but because their facial recognition systems were not trained to recognize individuals who had transitioned, this meant that a number of transgender drivers of Uber had to constantly re-identify, constantly affirm their recognition, and were constantly kicked off of the system because the system would basically say that their identification did not match their presentation. Another example of how AI-powered systems have deleterious impacts on trans and non-binary individuals. And we also see this in social media, where content filtering of LGBT-oriented content is often regularly labeled sensitive or sexualized content, when that content is actually not really sensitive or not really sexualized, but because the filters are trained to kind of over-survey content that is LGBT identified, this leads to restrictions on content. Now, the reason why this is such a huge problem is because many trans and non-binary individuals actually rely on things like YouTube and social media to create communities and to educate each other about different kinds of aspects and practices of the trans and non-binary community. So when those expressions are surveyed and censored, this winds up creating an impact on the kind of access to information that trans and non-binary individuals enjoy relative to the rest of the population. Oz Keyes, who's on this panel, Oz's work on automated gender recognition, which involves systems that automatically attribute whether or not you are a boy or a girl, has basically revealed that 95% of the literature fails to take into account the possibility that people might identify as something other than male or female, and also the possibility of misidentification is dramatic. So all of these different ways, and we can go to the next slide, all of these different ways create issues that are particularly felt by the trans and non-binary community. But they are effects that I think in many ways kind of imprison all of us who are concerned about a world in which we are not necessarily imposing scripts on people based on gender presentation or expectations that surround gender. And each of the examples that I just ran through involves kind of an automated recognition. And that automated misrecognition actually winds up producing a kind of erasure of the trans and non-binary community. That when we are in a system where there's a basic presumption of male and female categories, a binary system of gender, that winds up erasing populations. And while this is a huge problem in real space, it becomes an even greater problem as we rely on these private systems of artificial intelligence. And these issues are also really magnified when we add race and other categories into these classifications, because these systems are not trained on diverse data. And because these systems are not trained on diverse data, it means that individuals who do not fit certain categories are basically led to error classifications where it winds up producing a system where they get surveyed even greater in greater numbers, and they're more likely to be misrecognized as a result. And so what we basically argue in the paper is that each form of these kinds of misrecognition actually has dramatic impacts on the rights of individuals. It involves their right to exercise certain rights, a right to travel, a right to hold an occupation, a right to expect privacy, a right to speak and to express oneself freely. And then what this does is actually, when you think about the number of systems that are relying on these binary systems of gender, it creates a world where effectively these large communities of populations, many of which are very heavy users of social media, wind up facing negative consequences due to simply who they are and the fact that these systems do not recognize them. And that leads to greater surveillance, sorting, and recognition. And so the end part of the paper, and I apologize that I'm running through this very quickly, but I'm happy to send the paper to anyone who wants more detail, really grapples with the question of whether or not privacy is the answer. And in the paper, we basically suggest that privacy, while it is one step to solving the problem, does not actually solve the problem. It contributes to giving individuals a little bit more self-determination over their data and their identities. But the real issue is that these binary systems are not tasked with the responsibility of supporting gender self-determination. And that the best way of supporting gender self-determination is to really create a culture of what we think of as design justice. And the concept of design justice comes from Sasha Costanza-Chock, who is a professor at MIT, who has written a book actually about this concept. And the idea here is that rather than looking solely to law to solve these problems, while it certainly does go a long way in terms of providing individuals with the right to have some sort of gender self-determination, we also want to think about how these systems need to kind of code for design justice. And so we have to be careful to think when we are designing systems, when we're designing an algorithm, when we're training that algorithm on data, constantly questions of whether or not the data is diverse, whether or not the data is inclusive of particular populations, and whether or not we are effectively creating a system that perpetuates discrimination and inequality. And I think that in many ways is kind of the question that I want to sort of is, as much as we celebrate the advances of AI and other kinds of innovative technologies, we might actually be creating a world that has incredibly negative effects for particular communities who are not recognized by those systems. And the last thing that I want to say, and I want to end on this, because it really comes from Oz's wonderful work, is what the effects of this kind of erasure involve. And it's also important to keep in mind that many individuals within the trans and non-binary populations do not necessarily want to be recognized. So that also raises issues when it comes to privacy. But as Oz has written, if systems are not designed to include trans people, inclusion becomes an active struggle. Individuals must actively fight to be included in things as basic as medical systems, legal systems, and even bathrooms. And this is a problem that we particularly see in the United States, but it's a problem that I think is a global one. And I certainly hope that the attendees at this conference and at this panel, really think about the systems that are being designed and created and their impacts on particular communities. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much. This was a brilliant overview of the technologies that are out there, and also how can we think about all of this. I will immediately give the floor. So there was already somebody in the chat asking for the report, but now that you have given the email, so I suggest they write to you directly. So there's already interest in the report. I will give the floor to the next speaker, Oz. You don't have slides?
I do not, no. Yeah. So I will try and go along, despite the disconcerting nature of just looking at my own face. Hello. So as people have, I think, unjustifiably sort of like applauded me for, I have a long background in researching these systems, particularly automated gender recognition, the algorithmic side of things. And I think I've been studying these systems for about 3 years now, which is terrifying in a variety of ways, mostly because it was originally a side project that I started out of spite, and my intent was to write one paper and then move briskly on with my life. Unfortunately, the world had very different ideas, and so I spent the last 3 years doing other works and panels and fielding questions from journalists. And whenever I write something or get an email from a journalist, there are always a lot of questions that come up about automated gender recognition, but there's one question that, despite 3 years of thinking about this as basically a full-time job, I don't have an answer to, and I don't think anyone else has an answer to either, and it has pretty substantial implications for sort of policy and regulation around these technologies, and so I thought I would make that the topic of my spiel today. So let's start with some questions that we do know the answers to. First, what is automated gender recognition? The simplest answer is that it's a suite of technologies and a suite of different methods for trying to infer someone's gender from some kind of external data using an algorithm. Sometimes it is audio recordings. Sometimes this is not a joke, it is gait, how someone walks. There are people who have invested their careers in trying to gender people based on how they walk. But much of the time it is photographs, right? It's very similar to facial recognition systems more generally and uses many of the same technologies. So second question, what is AGR used for? So Sonia's given a great overview of a lot of the use cases in practice. I want to sort of zoom up a bit and sort of cluster them. Generally speaking, there are 3 use cases that we tend to see that people talk about for why they're developing AGR. So the first set is what Zuboff would call surveillance capitalism, or as I call it, normal capitalism. But apparently calling it normal capitalism doesn't get you a job at Harvard Business School. So there we go. And this is basically sort of marketing related uses. So trying to assess how many of your customers are of which gender so you know what to stock, or deploying billboards that are adaptive and responsive to the gender of people walking in front of them and display them different ads. A second class of uses, which Sonia already brought up, and I think sounds hyperbolic to a lot of people, as someone who is from the UK and living in the United States, and thus constantly nursing the small fear that maybe the rising global transphobia is something to do with me. Like everywhere I go, it gets worse. The sort of second use case there is around bathrooms. The idea is that where there are gendered spaces, we will stick a camera with one of these algorithms at the entrance to that space. And anyone who comes in, if they don't have the right gender for a space, security will be alerted, which is the sort of plan that was definitely come up with by a man, because literally nobody has ever thought that the thing that bathroom needs is surveillance cameras. So these are really easy cases to grasp, right? It's obvious when they're happening because they're user-facing, and it's also obvious what the harms are. You know, if you have ubiquitous, highly gendered advertisements, or more accurately, more ubiquitous, highly gendered advertisements, then you have, as Sonia said, like a reinforcement of sort of the social broadcasting of this very stereotypical and narrow range of possibilities for people. And please understand that when I say stereotypical and narrow-minded, narrow range, I mean that some of the literature specifically uses the example of using this to advertise pretty dresses to females and cars to males. And in the case of bathrooms, you know, the harms are obvious. If you have a system that is used to infer gender in sensitive and vulnerable and intimate spaces, and then alert security if people don't quite fit in, then given that we know that stereotypes and norms of gender are frequently racialized and are often like very rigid and trans-exclusionary, we would expect to see that trans people, particularly trans people of color, are disproportionately subject to intervention and harassment just for trying to pee. And, you know, actively going out of, being sort of intercepted by security or law enforcement is not a positive experience for anyone, but is definitely not for trans people, particularly trans people of color. So again, these are obvious, these are easy. You can be a complete dunderhead and still get them. You could be a 5-year-old child or a representative of the British government, or in the case of our Prime Minister, both. And you'd be able to grasp these perfectly easily. Where it gets difficult, though, is this third category of use cases, which is the very innocuous sounding and very vague sounding purely computational purposes. People develop gender recognition for purely computational purposes. And what this means is, despite its vagueness, actually something very specific. See, if you're developing a general facial recognition system, then what you want to do is have a system where it takes a single photograph as input and it compares it to a database of millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of existing photographs to see if it matches anyone in the system, and depending on whether it does or who it matches, react accordingly. To use the Uber example that Sonia brought up, because it's an excellent one, you know, part of it is to match to legal IDs. I imagine part of it is also to match to who have we thrown off our platform before, and are they trying to sneak back on, which involves, again, this comparison to this big data set of, you know, every photo that the system has. And the thing about that is that it is what computer scientists would say is expensive, which for everyone else is, it is slow, it takes a lot of processing power. Comparing one entry to millions of other entries is, and how best to do that is literally a long-standing mathematical problem. Computer scientists spend their entire careers trying to work out a way of doing this slightly more efficiently. It is a big task. And so when they say that they're using gender recognition for purely computational purposes, what they mean is that they think they found a way to basically cut the complexity and make the system a lot faster and a lot more efficient, because the logic goes like this. If you have all of the photographs in your database tagged with someone's gender. And if you can infer someone's gender when you're looking at the new photograph, then instantly you don't need to compare to the entire database. You need to compare to half the database. You can cut out everyone whose gender label doesn't match. The problems with this are fairly obvious. It doesn't work for people who are misgendered by the system. It doesn't work for people whose documentation is inconsistent. And amusingly, I am one of those people. In the course of researching this, I had to submit Freedom of Information Act requests to everyone under the sun. And it turns out that nobody in the US government knows how to gender my name. And so according to the CIA, I am a woman. And according to the State Department, I am a man. And I quite enjoy the image of them having a fight with each other. But the important thing here, though, is that these purely computational purposes deployments, right, make it a good demonstration of why it is impossible to answer the question, where is automated gender recognition being used, or how frequently is it being used? Because these computational uses exist in the background. They're not visible to the user. They're not immediately apparent. They exist somewhere in the guts of a more general facial recognition system. So in the case of Uber, again, we saw that trans people were disproportionately sort of being subject to, false treatment. And we believe that this is down to a limitation in the training data that the algorithm was using, that it was a facial recognition system more broadly, and it just didn't know what to do with trans faces. But it could well have also been that there was a subroutine that was inferring gender directly, and so spitting out the wrong answer, however diverse the general training data is, and we have no way from the outside of knowing. So at the beginning of this long spiel, I promised that there was a sort of policy or regulatory point to this, and there is, I promise. And it is this. As obvious as it sounds to everyone in the audience, and indeed my co-panelists, if you want something regulated or legislated, it is not enough to indicate that it is a problem. You have to indicate that it is a problem that is widespread or commonly experienced or present often enough and widely enough that legislative or regulatory authority should take notice. Or at least this is what my representative says every time I email them asking them to pass a law making it illegal for my upstairs neighbor to play dubstep at 2 in the morning. And when we talk about algorithmic regulation and law for sort of controlling and governing how algorithms are used, we normally talk about transparency as part and parcel of that, right? Like a bill to regulate algorithms should include some kind of expectation of transparency. But what I think the AGR example really gets at is that this is to, in some ways, put the cart before the horse, or maybe trying to open the box with the crowbar on the inside would be a better idiom. Without some degree of transparency, we literally do not know what to regulate. We have no way of telling how widely AGR is used, which means that it is very difficult to persuade people a lot of the time that it is worth paying regulatory or legal attention to. Because when they ask, how widely is it used, the answer I have to give is that the number is somewhere between everywhere we've empirically confirmed it's used and every single facial recognition system in the world. And that's a really big range. And so what I'm trying to get at is that, as well as sort of thinking about how we regulate AGR specifically, I think it's also worth drawing attention to the fact that we really need expectations of algorithmic transparency, not just after the fact in the right to explanation for individual users, but in terms of sort of public reporting. We need this to come not as part of a package of algorithmic regulations, but almost before it. Because until we have some sense of what people are doing, we cannot make informed decisions about what needs to be regulated and what doesn't. And that is everything I have. I have no idea how I'm doing on time, but hopefully I've left some for other people.
Thank you very much. I think we are doing fine, and yes, we are doing fine. This is so very interesting, and all the examples were very good. just perhaps I was thinking to link a bit with some of part of the audience that are perhaps thinking in terms of data protection. And Sonia, you mentioned privacy. I think indeed we are struggling to even know what to regulate. And for me, one of the illuminatory moments was a document by this European Data Protection Board. So the Board of Data Protection Authorities in Europe, they have this theory according to which classifying people on the basis of their gender, they say merely classifying people on the basis of their gender is not profiling. So we have some regulations for profiling, rules for profiling, and they say merely classifying on the basis of gender is not profiling. It's just, very simple operation that we do. We classify people on the basis of gender. And so indeed, like this, everything you might do about regulation of profiling just is useless for this problem. So indeed, I think we are struggling even at a moment to understand before what is that we acknowledge that is happening. With this, I just give the floor to the next speaker, who is Daniel.
Yeah, yes. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, thanks for the solidarity about no haircuts in Brussels, Sonia. I haven't been able to get there since last May, but maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah, thanks for the invitation to speak on this topic and for the organization. And I'm really happy to be on a panel with such great scholars and speakers. And again, I'll join the fan club for Oz and say that I'm a huge fan of Oz's work. And in fact, it was Oz's paper, The Misgendering Machines, that first alerted me to the dangers of automated gender attribution. Before talking about the work that we've done with Access Now, and I would just say as well, I was a Mozilla fellow, but as I'm actually now a Europe policy analyst at Access Now's Brussels office. I'll just briefly introduce Access Now for those of you who maybe don't know us. So we're a global civil society organization who aim to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world. We have a digital security helpline that works with individuals and organizations around the world to keep them safe online. We have offices all around the world, and in our Brussels office, we do a lot of EU-facing policy work with a focus on data protection, content governance, and AI. And our work on AI developed out of long-standing work on data protection. We were one of the first organizations calling for human rights standards to underlie AI development, as opposed to industry-led ethics approaches, about which Oz also has a great paper. Our Europe policy manager, Fanny Hidvegi, was a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group on AI. And throughout the work of that expert group, we advocated for red lines on certain use cases of AI, including facial recognition and behavioral prediction technologies. And I'll come back to this question of red lines later. Also, along with Amnesty International and a number of other organizations and researchers, we drafted the Toronto Declaration on protecting the rights to equality and non-discrimination in machine learning systems. Now, let me say a bit about how we came to work on automated gender attribution. So around the time that I read Oz's paper, I also happened to talk to a trans friend who told me a story which Sonia already illustrated about going through an airport body scanner, where they experienced this issue because, exactly as was described, the scanner detected abnormalities according to one gender attribution. So they had to go through again this entire invasive questioning and searching procedure. That was entirely the result of some programmer, the designers of the system, mistakenly believing that they could develop a system to automatically detect, or as we more correctly say on this panel, assign gender to people. Shortly after hearing this anecdote, one of my colleagues based in our Latin America got in touch because they had a request from the Brazilian consumer organization IDEC for collaboration on a civil action case that they'd taken up against the operator of a metro line in Sao Paulo. And the issue was, and this goes back to the first category of use cases that Oz talked about, that the operator of the metro line had installed a system of smart billboards. And these billboards aim to show more relevant ads or favorite use case to passers-by by making inferences about their age, emotion, and gender. And this caught our attention for a number of reasons, including the impossibility of consent from passers-by, the dubious scientific status of emotion recognition, and the use of automated gender attribution. It also confirmed a worry that I had for a while because a lot of the pushback against facial recognition systems uses arguments around identification-based harms. And I had the idea that a devious startup founder might try to circumvent these arguments by removing the personal identification component from a facial recognition system and instead offer behavioral and audience analytics while preserving anonymity. And this is precisely what it turned out this company was doing. And in fact, they claimed that their system was GDPR compliant. We filed an expert opinion on the case, and a large part of that was a discussion of the lack of validity and enormous potential for harm of automated gender attribution. The expert opinion contained plenty of zingers, which I would usually repeat in my presentation. However, they were all quotes from Oz's paper, so in the present company, I will relinquish them to their author. But zingers aside, the danger that we highlighted was how a system that infers gender from physiognomy will always, provided that it's even something that could work, discriminate against trans and gender non-conforming individuals. It undermines their right to self-determination, as we've heard, by operationalizing a binary, physiologically based conception of gender that erases their existence. And, you know, while an advertising billboard in a metro station might not seem particularly high risk, we thought it was important to push back against this for a number of reasons. And, you know, in Oz's paper, they point out that, you know, a trans man walking along who suddenly sees a billboard flicker from an ad for power tools to an ad for a pretty summer dress will not be particularly happy about it. And I mean, in general, you know, it raises an issue of kind of ridiculous gender-based ad profiling. But there's also a very real risk that kind of obvious indicators like this could alert someone in the vicinity that a person is trans, which could lead to a dangerous situation. And I think pushing back against these seemingly innocuous use cases is important because it attacks the idea that such systems and the use of automated gender attribution is mundane, harmless, normal, just a routine function. I think this automated gender attribution needs to be opposed now as a technology because the next thing we know, you know, it's going to be used, as I was highlighted, to control access to public toilets. I think as well, it's just really important to highlight that there is no good reason that anyone needs to be using this technology. I mean, Oz raised the issue of computational purposes and, you know, if it's helping expediency in the use of a facial recognition system, but we always have to think, you know, necessity and proportionality. Is it worth the risk that these systems pose and the fundamental incompatibility of this technology with the rights of trans and non-gender conforming people? Whatever benefit someone's getting out of it, and I mean, in the case of, you know, marketing billboards, I mean, who actually wants to see these stupid relevant ads? I think it's never going to pass that necessity and proportionality test. And in our discussions with EU policymakers, we've repeatedly pointed to automated gender attribution as a clear-cut case of something that needs to be banned. I don't see the arguments for using it at all, and I think we really need to push that. We've also raised it in the Council of Europe's ad hoc committee on AI, the KAHI, where there's an ongoing discussion of red lines for AI use cases. And I'd like to mention here that the Council of Europe's Convention 108 guidelines on facial recognition were published yesterday on Data Protection Day, which have some interesting language on a ban on the use of facial recognition, and I quote, "for the sole purpose of determining a person's skin color, religious or other belief, sex, racial or ethnic origin, age, health, or social status," which hopefully can add some ammo in the fight against this technology. Nevertheless, we think that the Council of Europe and the European Commission and other regulators need to go a step further and ban all applications which are inherently in conflict with fundamental rights. And I think in the case of automated gender attribution, that's a no-brainer. You know, we, as examples, point to remote biometric identification systems, but also to this. As a final point, and, you know, there's lots more to discuss, I'd just like to say that in terms of taking the work forward, Access Now is in talks with some LGBT rights organizations, and Oz is also part of the discussion, I believe, about putting together a campaign against automated gender attributions. So hopefully there'll be some interesting stuff coming soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting, and I like this message that you send, that the problem is that we just accept this as a normal thing that will happen. And I think it was Sonia's point that we are imprisoned by these categories and just we accept this like this. I hope the audience knows that really the cases where this happens are many, and it's about facial recognition, but it's about being online, about ads online, about the content that we see when I'm on Twitter. It depends. If you're female, male, you're categorized by something, you receive different content and the way in which they decide that you are female or male. It could be your name, but it could be just the behavior that they think it's your male behavior, and people are just classified, not just different people who are misclassified. We are all just potentially misclassified. So it's a really a very widespread issue. Okay, sorry if I do little interventions, but I really like the subject. And I now give the floor finally to Karen.
Thank you very much, Gloria, and thank you very much to all the three previous speakers. It's been fascinating listening to you. And I think as a policymaker, it's really important that we look at artificial intelligence, which is the algorithms behind the gender attribution mechanisms, and recognize that they are built by people, and they are built by people that have certain ideas about how society works and how certain people in society works. So basically, we're taking the boxes that we've built around ourselves in society and building artificial intelligence on those. And then we're using artificial intelligence to actually reinforce those boxes built on stereotypes in society. So you're making the impressions and the ideas that people have of what a specific gender is like, what a quote real woman, a real man is supposed to be like. You're supposed to be butch if you're a man, you're supposed to be femme if you're a woman, and if you are anything but that, then you are wrong, and it will not fit into the boxes. And the problem is that our ideas and stereotypes don't fit reality. It is not, who we are is not determined by our gender, it's determined by our personality. And we see again and again that both companies, but also individuals in society, that they are applying these gender stereotypes on people, on students, on children. And this has real life effects on the way that our lives are determined. And we shouldn't be allowing artificial intelligence and technology to reinforce these wrong impressions. And if we think that this is perhaps a new thing, then I want to come with an example that is by the head of the National Museum in Denmark, who is an archaeologist. And there was a grave with a warrior that was buried with the weapons of the warrior, and was a female skeleton. And the archaeologists from the Victorian time decided that there must have been a mix-up with the skeleton, because you couldn't have a skeleton with female hips in a warrior grave with weapons. It must be that the warrior was taken out, or her body was placed there, or that these were really the weapons of her husband or brother or something else, because the idea of a woman being a warrior didn't fit their Victorian age stereotypes. It's been later been proven that the scars of the bones show signs that this person has been into combat. But this really just underlines that our stereotypes and our ideas of how we think the world is influences the way that we see facts and the way that we interpret them. And beyond having sort of an influence on those of us who sort of conform to the sort of center parts of the boxes that society put us in, it is really problematic and is a safety risk and can cause trauma and stress to those of us who are closer to the edges of the boxes. So if you are transgender, if you are intersex, it has much more grave influences on the way that you're able to live your lives. And it is, for me, I think it's important that we use technology to actually allow more of us to live as full, free, and complete lives as possible, and not the contrary. And also the developing this kind of technology, even if it is flawless or can be diversified more, it is also based on a wrong idea of who we are as humans. It is based on a classification, a labeling of people, so that we can put people into boxes, and this leads to racism and discrimination. And in the case of the billboards, of outing people involuntarily. And I think this is really something that we need to be aware of when we look at the regulation of artificial intelligence and facial or biometric recognition, because if we do not think of diversity in the way that we present of who we are as persons, when we regulate technology, then we will cause real harm to people out there. And I think the point that Oz had, that we need to have transparency of the algorithms before we do the legislation, is actually quite important. So therefore, I think when we're regulating artificial intelligence, we should perhaps have first a demand for how we're able to look behind the screen to see what the algorithms are actually doing. And then we need a second step of regulating how they're working and what we're using them for. But we need to start acting soon, because the technology is already out there and is being used, as Sonia was showing us. So I'm really happy to have been part of this panel and listen to the presentations, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much. That's interesting indeed. I think it's also for me one of the points why this discussion is interesting, because it's about classifying people, and a very basic classification that we are all familiar with. If we cannot address this, can we address all sorts of classifications that are happening with artificial intelligence? I'm not sure. There are a number of questions that go in different directions. I would just perhaps ask you first, I think maybe the most important question here is about really the policy choices that we have. Should we ban something? Can we ban something? What can we ban if we have to ban something? I think the question is, could we just say no to automated gender recognition or attribution like this, or can we stop it? Can we perhaps regulate just the collection of data about gender? We know from a European perspective, we treat as sensitive data some categories of data. For instance, sexual orientation is sensitive. So in principle, you have to be aware if somebody is collecting this data about you. Gender identity is not a sensitive, even a sensitive type of data. So then the restrictions are very, very much lower. Do we have to do something about this? So now I'm talking as a lawyer. What could we do? What is possible? First with Sonia, perhaps we should start.
So I think that is in many ways kind of the question that is really the most difficult to answer. I guess I tend to believe in the United States. I mean, I think the way that we're way behind in the United States when it comes to informational privacy. And I think that in many ways we can kind of take the example of what we see in the EU as the kinds of ways in which you can design a system by thinking about fundamental rights as a framework. I think we're not at that point in the United States. So to me, I think any question of how we regulate would have to start with the first point that I think Oz made about the need for algorithmic transparency. From there, you could start by giving people an entitlement that allows them to expect the right to have gender self-determination as part of their experience as being a consumer. So thinking about those kinds of issues as a bundle of consumer rights, because individuals in the trans non-binary communities are consumers just like anyone else. And so trying to create ways in which the market can respond more effectively, I think, is a really important way to start.
Thank you very much. I think that's many good points. Oz, do you want to follow up?
I guess I would say I would agree with those thoughts, both in terms of like the US specific components and also the broader need to as Sonia says, consider it more than solely a matter of privacy. I think one of the, I'm not sure, I need to think through like what the implications of treating it as a consumer protection issue are, but I think one of the big limitations of privacy law around gender is that it sort of implies that if it's private, anything goes. If it's public, then we can regulate. And I think that you know, algorithmic systems and or late stage capitalism are the point at which we see that privacy as a sole way of determining where we intervene and also where the bounds of intervention are is not really a thing that we can solely rely on. You know, increasing spaces are hybridized public and private, and regulating solely through the lens of privacy risks ending up in this space where, strictly speaking, it's fine because it was done by a private organization, or strictly speaking, it's fine because there was this tiny notice at 7 feet above the ground in size 10 font that said that you knew what you were getting into. And so I really like Sonia's point about going broader than just privacy itself. I would personally come down entirely in favor of just banning the damn technology. As Daniel said, nobody has ever, you know, I get a lot of pushback because I've always maintained that banning it is the only appropriate response. And in multiple years of doing this, nobody has come up with a convincing use case for what this is actually good for. And I think that says a lot. People talk about the idea that we should justify banning things, or we should justify controlling things. And I would like to ask, why not? Why is it not the other way around? If you are developing systems which are literally predicated on the stereotyping and structuring and constraining of individuals, and you literally cannot point to a spot where it's going to get it right, why is the onus on everyone else to justify its lack of existence? You know, if I start using nuclear weapons as like earth-moving devices, I'm not sure someone should have to justify and explain to me why that isn't a good idea. I'm pretty sure the onus should be on me to explain what the hell I think I'm doing. So yeah, I would personally just endorse fully banning it. I think that legislation in and of itself is of limited utility unless it's backed by a wider sort of social moral confrontation with the question of what role does technology play in our life and how is it developed and in whose interests. But to be frank, I try and address those questions through teaching, not through advocacy, because the population of the world as a whole tends not to listen to me. The people whose like GPA I impact tends to.
Yes, Karen?
I think it's quite interesting that attributing a gender to people is not seen as profiling, whereas sexuality or race would be seen as more protected. I think this probably comes from a lack of awareness of how many stereotypes we have concerning gender, where there is a growing, but we're not yet there, awareness of the stereotypes that we have in gender and how destructive they are to the life opportunities we have in a population. And therefore, I think we need to really look at this carefully. Also, because we also have a tangent problem, which is that there is not enough research on the differences that gender and hormones make on our bodies. So there's a book called Invisible Women that shows that gender is not being integrated in the product development and in the research because it's just too annoying to have all of this diversity in your research. So we just stick with a male, cis, preferably white men as test objects, and then we develop our products on that. So we need to make sure that we protect everybody against the gender stereotypes, but that we at the same time make sure that we have products that can take into account all the different variations of gender that there is. And I think the the case of the body scanners at airports is a combination of the two evils. You have something that is developed for binary gender world, and at the same time you have a lot of stereotypes about how we are supposed to be with genders, and then it sort of clashes there.
Thank you very much. Just for a bit of context, it might be interesting to know that we did some research about this question of gender identity as a special category of data. And actually, when the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was discussed before it was adopted, somebody at the European Parliament, that we don't know who, they suggested that it should be regarded as a sensitive type of data. So they proposed this, but then this was never adopted. And generally, the explanation, the reply that we hear is just, oh, it will be so complicated to stop processing data about gender. It's like this.
Seems like I have homework.
Yes, yes. But I've tried to ask my contacts, and we cannot trace back the author of this. It was an amendment, and then yes, it never worked. Daniel, I don't know if you want to say something about what do you want to have banned, because somebody has asked, could you please repeat exactly what are the red lines so we understand exactly what do you want everybody to do?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so it's an incredibly rich discussion. I have a lot to say about all of it. But yeah, as well, I think just one quick thing about the gender. I think maybe one thing we need to look at is the difference between gender data as, you know, provided by the person where they've determined they've filled out a form or they've said it versus inferences. I think there's really a fundamental difference when it's the person identifying themselves versus inferring it about them. To come to the bans question, I mean, I just, something I wanted to circle back on as well is that what I think design justice is really important. We also need to be careful that we're not perfect, you know, when we talk about having diverse training data and things, that we're not perfecting instruments of surveillance or oppression. And I think that's the case with facial recognition, remote biometric identification, and a lot of the related technologies there. Getting into the conversation about technical fixes is the wrong thing totally. And what we've put forward as a kind of a heuristic for figuring out what needs to be banned is systems or applications of AI where the harms that they cause are not mitigable. There's no way that through any kind of legal safeguards, technical improvements, you know, as I said, putting up signs or something, you can't mitigate the harm that these systems cause to fundamental rights. And we've put out as Access Now in our response to the European Commission's white paper on AI. We have a list. I can read it out if there's any interest. But you know, some of the things that we've covered are indiscriminate biometric surveillance and biometric capture and processing in publicly accessible spaces. You know, the use of AI to solely determine access to or delivery of essential public services. There's a long list, but I think fundamentally just thinking about it in that sense that there's a diluted idea, and unfortunately it's one of the pillars of the European Commission's strategy on AI, which is that we need to promote AI uptake, as if we need more AI. We do just have to make sure that we mitigate the risks. But what we've pointed out again and again is there are just certain applications which fundamentally contradict with our fundamental values. And there's no way to polish the turd. These systems cannot be developed. We can't roll them out and maintain and support our values and our rights.
Thank you very much. I will jump on the fact that you mentioned harms, because there is a question about harms. And the question, I think, was if you could say a bit more about the harms, the potential harms of the use of automated gender attribution for simply computational purposes, individual and collective harms. And then there is something about whether this has an impact on identification. I think that between the lines is that maybe precisely it doesn't work for the purpose it's supposed to serve. Could you say something?
Totally. So in terms of harms, let's operate from the assumption that the user never becomes aware of why the misclassification is occurring. I say this because if they do, there are arguably different and wider harms, right, around like how people's presentation is sort of managed in a sociological sense. But so let's assume that it generally stays behind the scenes. Again, like you tend to see this in the case of generalized facial recognition systems, and they are often looking for faces for a reason, to determine, in the case of Uber, whether someone should be allowed to drive. In the case of airports, whether they should be allowed to fly. Now, in and of itself, it getting the label wrong for purely computational purposes may not sound bad, but in practice, what that means is that if the label, if the entry is mislabeled and the user ends up not appearing in, then when if the entry is mislabeled, then when the data set is filtered down to just people who match the inaccurate label, that may not contain the person who is being evaluated. And so the result of this is that the system may completely draw a blank and fail to make any match in a way that, and for reasons that are not actually evident to the user and are not things that the user can intervene. It's not something like a case of, the lighting is bad, like please hold the camera at a different angle. There is no way of making a match because the system is trying to find data that is not there. It's trying to find an entry that says you're a woman when you're not, or a man when you're not. And so really it's what the harms look like are the same harms that could otherwise result from people not being in the system. What happens if you try and fly and your photo your photo match doesn't work because you officially don't exist in the database? What if you try and register to drive for Uber and you're in the wrong category? In those specific cases, I don't know precisely what results, because again, we lack this transparency. We don't know if the code is there or what it's doing, if so. But generally speaking, in situations where facial recognition is being used for profiling, AGR disproportionately, when integrated for these purely computational purposes, ups the risk that trans people will be profiled incorrectly. And what the results of that are will vary from system to system.
Thank you very much. I hope this answers the question. I'm trying to respect the will of the audience by asking their questions. And there was somebody who had a question about for Sonia and whether you have been working on these gender binary classifications and medical research. And so in the medical context, I know there is a lot of reflection about precisely what is invisible women type of problem that we have less data about some issues. Have you been working on this medical context and the use of binary gender classifiers?
Yeah, well, I'm trained as a lawyer, so I tend to not rely on medical research as heavily as I'm sure other people do. In general, I think that the overwhelming kind of sentiment of many who work deeply in these areas is that this whole idea that we have a gender is actually a composite of a whole variety of other factors that go so far beyond just the question of how one presents. There are questions about hormones, questions about anatomy, questions about self-identity, questions about, there are just so many different ways in which there are variables that go into the determination of what one's gender is. And the reason why I just say that is because, I think many of us on this panel have had the same reaction from reading Oz's work, which is like the first time that you read The Misgendering Machines, you realize that these systems are not just, confined to AGR. They are systems that all of us have been operating on, and that many of us, are really faced with the apparent costs of these systems. My student, who is my co-author, is a trans woman, and has written painfully about her experiences when she travels. And so I just believe that, once you look at the medical research and how complicated the determination of gender is, and then you look at the real life costs of what it means to impose these gender categories on individuals. And and how we just do not create structures that entitle individuals to a right to gender self-determination and recognition, you really do see this as one of the fundamental injustices of our era. And the fact that we have created these AI-driven systems that replicate and impose these injustices, it's just, as a lawyer, someone who thinks about justice, I just find it unacceptable, frankly.
Thank you very much. Any reactions to this? If you want to take the floor, because otherwise there is a question less about the banning. So we can agree that we want to have something banned, but perhaps we will not have this ban immediately. Then which safeguards do we need? Do we need some safeguards? I hear that the computational issue there. I think that's indeed important. I heard also very interesting this self-determination, that people should have a right to somehow be informed and then decide. Which will be for you the necessary safeguards, perhaps waiting for a ban, or in case there is no ban? Any specific safeguards that you really think we clearly should have, or we just agree? Yes, of course.
Frankly, I've been thinking about this for a while. I'm going to do the philosopher thing, which is invalidate the question rather than answer it, because that's what philosophers do. I think that it is that there is no safeguard that would actually be a safeguard. The fact of the matter is that the system is fundamentally premised on this assumption that gender is a fixed, externally sort of inferable binary, and reality is more complex than that. And if the goal of safeguards is to say, okay, so we will bring into alignment their model of gender with sort of liberal, democratic, philosophical desires for equal or equitable treatment. There is no way of doing that. There have been attempts to expand these AGR systems to include more than 2 genders. They don't work, which anyone who thinks about gender could have told you in advance. And there have been attempts through things like the right to explanation, for example, and efforts around accountability to at least produce like some mechanisms of redress, right? But here's the thing. If we have developed the most elegant mechanisms for redress in the world, there are appellate mechanisms, there are demands for justification, but those mechanisms are only experienced or disproportionately experienced by and necessary for particular subgroups of society, then that is still producing a discriminatory harm and outcome. Sonia's example of Uber, right? Part of the harm, obviously, is that the system is getting it wrong, and so people are being thrown off the platform. But another part of the harm is that constant work of having to re-justify yourself over and over and over again to the system. Now, there could be proposals for things that would sort of streamline this process of getting it corrected when the system gets it wrong. But that's still going to be additional work. That's still producing a disproportionate outcome, and it is, in exchange for still producing a disproportionate outcome, I feel reduces the urgency of the moral imperative around just banning this. Ameliorative fixes are for systems that can be ameliorated. Gender recognition is not one of them.
Thank you. I'm a bit afraid of asking the following question because it might be invalidated, but I will try to phrase it nicely. I don't know if it's an alternative. So I think the idea is that in any case, like companies like to classify people on segments. I think marketing likes gender. We had gender classification of things, stores for women, stores for men. So I think the idea is could we imagine other types of segments that we will be happy with? I suppose there will be non-gendered segments. I don't know exactly. It's difficult to interpret the question just like this. An abstraction of consumers with which we will be happy with, or we just refuse abstraction of consumers. How do we deal with this? And we know that from an online perspective, there was this very interesting work saying that Facebook gave the possibility for people to have these 65 different types of gender, and then they chose what they wanted, and then people investigating this discovered that in the end you were classified male or female because that's what how the marketing works. So we are entering the 5 last minutes. Perhaps if you could, all of you, take the floor, say whatever you want, but if you want to say something about this, I think is it a problem about gender classification as such, or the use of technologies to classify through gender? Whatever are your thoughts? And so you have.
I think a little bit of the problem with the gender classification is that we're not actually classifying something, as Oz was saying, that is fixed and tangible, but we're trying to classify people according to our stereotypes. If a person has short hair, it must be more a male than a female, and if the person likes fast cars, it must be more male than if the person likes frilly dresses. This has nothing to do with our gender or our gender identity. It has something to do with the stereotypes that society has about gender. And therefore, gender attribution doesn't really serve a purpose and can only be flawed. And therefore, I think it does not make sense to create systems that try to put us into boxes according to the stereotypes that society has. And thank you very much for inviting me onto this panel. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. We will move then backwards to Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, again, I would really just support everything that Oz said. And I mean, I think it's a total dead end to get into a question of figuring out how to fix behavioral targeted advertising, with adding in more categories. We need to look at the fact that the system is in itself hugely problematic. And, I would just point to an example of the Dutch ad agency Ster, who introduced contextual advertising instead of targeted, and is more effective actually, and doesn't rely on profiling people according to ridiculous attributes. Again, I'll just reiterate the question of bans, and maybe to say that I think what Oz highlighted there is there are just certain applications of machine learning where the fundamental question is just wrong. Predicting someone's or inferring someone's gender from physiognomy or behavior or their name, and other totally ridiculous examples like predicting criminality, which is in itself a ridiculous category, from physiognomic data. All of these systems, you just can't fix them. The question in itself is fundamentally flawed, and there's no solution, there's no safeguards that can protect us from that. So these are systems where there just needs to be a red line drawn.
Thank you very much. Oz, any thoughts? No, we have 3 minutes, I think, and we are not going to just leave this question. No, I give the 3 minutes to Sonia. Yes, Sonia, please. The microphone.
Sorry, everyone. It's the story of my year, is constantly speaking when I'm on mute. I guess the only thing that I would say is, to really take into account Karen's observation that, these technologies and these systems are designed by humans, and humans reflect the presumptions, that they are often born and cultured with. And so in many ways, I think that we are asking a lot of technology when we ask technology to be more thoughtful and more inclusive, because we live in a society that has not always demonstrated a level of thoughtfulness and inclusivity. But I guess, in the United States, I will take as, great inspiration the fact that, a very conservative Supreme Court last year handed down a decision that was a landmark decision in favor of trans rights and equality, and banning employment discrimination against trans individuals. Now, I feel that if the most conservative court in the United States can take this position, then there is no reason for why we should not ask that of technologies. There's no reason for why we should not ask that of our large tech companies who have enormous resources to devote to the problem of making sure that these communities are seen and included. Now, that is admittedly a completely different angle then I think the more desirable question about whether or not to ban these technologies, which I totally agree is a much more desirable solution. And we are seeing examples where that is happening. Cities like Oakland have banned the use of facial recognition technologies. So it is possible for us to imagine that world. The problem is that there's a real disconnect between what the state in the United States is really interested in doing and what the private market is interested in doing. And I think that that's a very different set of circumstances than that we see in the EU, where there's a much stronger sense of entitlement to things like privacy. While imperfect, there is much more of a sense of a fundamental right. So I would just, end by thanking all of you on this panel and saying that these questions are left to be unresolved, and I hope we can all play a role in answering them inclusively.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting, very useful. I hope for everybody it was very useful for me. I thank all the speakers very, very much. You cannot hear an applause, but I will do it like this. And just hope to see you somewhere. There's a platform somewhere, otherwise in the next online event or somewhere in real life. But thank you very much, and yes, take care. Bye-bye.